Welcome to part 2 in this series, Tailor-Made Tariffs. Now, first things first, or is it second? It can't be overstated that we must first measure and understand demand, and then design tariffs to influence the demand based on the supply constraints. Just like the picture, cart before the horse? I don't think so. And we need to use the right tool for the job. The application of a change in tariff has really only 3 possible outcomes: no effect, negative outcomes, or positive outcomes. So it's essential to try to understand the consequences before we implement a change in tariff. Changes in tariff can have a wide-ranging effect on consumers and the economy. Just ask Daffy.
You're gonna hurt somebody that way! Probably me.
So a quick recap from our first video. Remember that demand and supply curves can be conveniently linked together. Utilities can measure existing and projected demand requirements, that's shown on the graph on the right, and by charting existing and projected generation capability on the left, we can determine the corresponding cost effectiveness and maintainability. As I've mentioned, the tools we're using are the tariffs, and there's different types of tariffs one can use, just like tools in a toolbox. There's fixed tariffs, block or step tariffs, time of use tariffs, and block time of use tariffs. A common mistake is to mismatch the timescales that we want to apply the tariff over with the period with which we wish to influence demand. Common sense, right?
You're absolutely correct.
And finally, just one more thing before we look at the different tariff types. Remember that electricity meters measure energy, that's in kilowatt hours, and not power, which is kilowatts, that's the demand. Water meters measure volume, that's in kiloliters, and not flow, kiloliters per day, that's the water demand. So we must always be mindful of the influence of the meter measurement period when we're trying to apply tariffs which limit demand. Okay, enough of the wheres and wherefores, let's look at a flat tariff. It consists of a single tariff rate, that's one parameter, which doesn't vary with demand, consumption, or time. As there's no tariff period and the rate doesn't vary, clearly it's not possible to influence demand in any meaningful way. So you may ask, why do utilities use flat tariffs? The answer is because they're simple to implement and for consumers to understand. The second type of tariff that we're going to look at is a block or step tariff. A block tariff consists of different tariff rates applied at different consumption levels, that's of energy or volume, over a given fixed tariff period, typically a month. There's therefore 2 parameters, the horizontal x-axis, which is the consumption threshold, and the vertical y-axis, which is the tariff rate. This is conveniently demonstrated with our Lego blocks. The first block, the off-peak rate, applies up to level 1. The blue block, at the standard rate, applies up to level 2. And the peak rate applies for all volume or energy thereafter. A quick trick question. Why is the tariff linked to energy or volume and not demand, power or flow? Remember, meters measure consumption, energy or volume. That's why. Sometimes a utility will add threshold charges to a block tariff. These are levied if or when a consumer's consumption reaches a given level. They've been levied by utilities as a very rudimentary form of demand charge, but I have seen threshold charges for all sorts of things. As we can see, a monthly block tariff does not effectively control peak or off-peak daily demand because the timescales are different, but a lot of utilities mistakenly do use this tariff for this purpose. It can intentionally or unintentionally reduce the average demand over the period due to the increased monthly cost to the consumer.
That's just plain old silly!
Monthly block tariffs are therefore useful for reducing water demand during periods of high consumption because the demand period and tariff period are relatively well aligned. Earlier I mentioned threshold fixed charges, but also time-based or demand network charges are also very popular with utilities. Utilities can levy a time-based charge, typically daily, in order to cover the ongoing cost of network infrastructure maintenance or provisioning, irrespective of what consumption a consumer may use. This is effectively for the privilege of having electricity or water at all. This again is a rudimentary form of demand charge. The The higher the power requirements of the consumer, the higher the charge. Moving on to the third type of tariff, which is a time of use tariff, these kind of tariffs are gaining popularity with utilities in order to try and address the demand problem, but they don't do it particularly well. A time of use tariff consists of different tariff rates applied at different times of the day. There's two parameters, the horizontal or x-axis being time, and the vertical axis being the tariff rate. So if we look at our Lego blocks again, we can see that the off-peak rate is charged in the early morning. Then from late morning, the peak rate is charged, followed by a standard rate at midday, the peak rate again in the late afternoon, the evening, followed by an off-peak rate in the late evening. Times and rates, of course, will vary from utility to utility. It's important to note that there's no relation to either consumption or demand with the time of use tariff. The times and rates are chosen to roughly coincide with the demand curve, but demand doesn't form one of the two parameters. As I mentioned previously, a daily time of use tariff is often applied to try and control daily demand, but it does so in a very strong-handed and unpopular manner. For example, if you look at the graph on the left, the first and every kilowatt hour consumed in the late morning period is charged at the peak rate. And it gets worse because the cost is equal to the energy times the tariff rate, so there's an immediate multiplying effect. I've illustrated this in the table on the left-hand side, which is best represented by the graph in the middle. I've shown that the tariff rates there are between 1, 2 and 3, 1 in the off-peak and 3 in the peak period. So there's a 3-to-1 ratio on the tariff rates. I've overlaid this with the demand or load profile, where the ratio of the peak to the off-peak demand is 2.5 to 1. Now, as you can see, if you multiply 2.5 by 3, you get a ratio of 7.5 to 1 in relation to the cost, as shown in the graph at the bottom. This is simply not realistic, and therefore time of use tariffs are notoriously unpopular. There's also a sense that time of use tariffs are not only used to reduce peak demand, but also to significantly increase revenue. This is what Bugs has to say about that.
You realize that this is not going to go unchallenged.
And while we're here, let's talk about notified maximum demand. Large commercial and industrial consumers are required to indicate how much power they will require in kilovolt amps. This is the notified maximum demand, or NMD. The consumer is charged a true demand charge for each kVA of the NMD required. Very often a consumer will exceed the NMD for brief periods and incur consequential penalties. Now you might think that the penalties would relate to the severity and corresponding period of each event, and the penalty charges levied accordingly. However, very often the highest demand of the entire period, which is known as the maximum demand, is used to calculate the penalty and then also applied across the entire tariff period. There's no getting away from the fact that if you want to influence demand, then the parameters that you use must be related to the demand curve. That specifically relating to the more you use, the more you get charged for, as well as the more you use in certain particular times, the more expensive it will become. A block time of use tariff combines the advantages of the block tariff with the time of use tariff. So now there are three parameters. I've represented the tariff rate with color, the horizontal or x-axis is time, and the vertical or y-axis is the consumption threshold. So once again, using our Lego blocks, we can see that in the early morning period there is first of all an off-peak rate, followed by a standard rate at the higher levels. In late morning, the standard rate applies first of all, followed by a peak rate. At midday, the standard rate applies, after which the peak rate is applied. In the afternoon and evening, the standard rate applies, but at a slightly lower threshold before the peak rate kicks in. And in the late afternoon, the off-peak rate applies up to level 1, beyond which the standard rate then applies. The combination of block levels and times produces an acceptable compromise between consumer and supplier. It lowers peak consumption and peak demand and encourages off-peak consumption. So for example, the first kilowatt hour consumed at the beginning of the late morning period is charged at the standard rate up to the consumption level 1, after which the peak rate is charged. Now, some of you may say, it's too complicated for consumers to understand. Well, here's a question. Do you understand your mobile phone tariff? On what basis do consumers evaluate the right mobile package for themselves? Well, I'll tell you, it's based on cost. They don't try and understand the tariff, they just want to see if it's affordable at the end of the day. The other question is it too complicated to implement? Not so. In the last part of this series, we'll explore tariff implementation with particular reference to implementing these kinds of tariffs with prepayment meters.
Ingenuity triumphs every time.
The secret, of course, is to have constant cost comparisons between one tariff design and another. As we've already discussed, the desired demand or load profile must drive the tariff design. The cost to the consumer is the area under the curve, so in order to influence demand only and not the cost to the consumer, try to keep the area underneath the graph the same before and after the tariff has been applied. A successful outcome is where the demand curve from the new tariff is slightly squashed and wider, with the same area under the demand curve. In the next part, the puzzle of prepayment tariffs, we will look at the difficulties associated with combining prepayment and complex tariffs.